This is the Darcy Giroux Podcast, episode 53. Today, my guest is Gary Chartier. He is a legal scholar, philosopher, political theorist, and theologian. We're going to be talking about anarchism. Gary Chartier, welcome to the Darcy Giroux Podcast. How are things?
Great to be here. Thanks for having me, and looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, right on. So I'll do a little introduction. Gary Chartier is a legal scholar, philosopher, political theorist, and theologian. His work addresses anarchism and ethics. I stole that right off of a Wikipedia article.
Right.
Yeah, that's right. Everything on the internet is correct.
Right. Yeah.
But I did want to make sure, are you still at the university? And sorry, I forget the name.
Sure. I'm the associate dean of the business school at La Sierra University in Riverside, California. The
Yeah,
Common
right
Vice
on.
of Our School of Business. Um,
Okay, yeah. Where I first heard of you is you were very involved with the Center for a Stateless Society at one point. Now, are you still involved there?
I am still a fellow of the center. I don't publish there all the time, but I'm trying to think when the last time was. I ran an op-ed there, but yeah, I've been a fellow there for oh my, probably 13 years or so.
Yeah. Yeah, right on. I haven't followed them closely recently either myself, but I mean, if we're going back
Yeah.
10 years, I mean, I remember they were putting out lots of good stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. So one of the things I find interesting about your work is that you come from you consider yourself a leftist. Is that correct?
So I have spent a lot of time reflecting on what it might mean to be a left libertarian and a left market anarchist. And I recognize that we can, we can spend a lot of time dancing around how we want to use words, and different people obviously want to employ those in different ways. There's an essay that I wrote, again, probably 2011, 2012, called The Distinctiveness of Left Libertarianism, that I think I would pretty much still be happy to endorse, in which I try to explain the ways in which the sort of approach I take, I hope, partakes authentically of both libertarian and leftist, kind of sources and resources and so forth. We Left clearly gets used in a lot of different ways. If you think in the American political context, when folks talked, for instance, about in later years about the old left, they often had in mind really kind of Stalinists in the 30s, and I have just pretty much zero enthusiasm for those folks. But I think the new left of the 1960s included a lot of interesting and important strands that I would absolutely want to affirm and embrace as regards kind of social freedom and social experimentation, opposition to war and empire, and a desire to uh, include and empower people who had been pushed to the margins. And so, you know, you can obviously be kind of squishy about definitions, but I continue to think that, yeah, those folks in that particular era, the New Left, that included so many different, interesting, overlapping strands from movements for, the liberation of marginalized ethnic and cultural groups, to the women's movement, to the anti-war movement, to the social experimentation of the hippies, to movements for sexual freedom and the empowerment of sexual minorities. That whole kind of sort of cascade of mutually reinforcing positions that made up the New Left, I'm sure one could find things to criticize about, but I also think there's something valuable to affirm and learn from. So I'd want to emphasize that was the kind of strand of self-identified thought on the left that I find the most fruitful and interesting.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Um, so maybe let's look at, what the distinction, what you would define as the distinction between left and right then.
Oh, that's really interesting. And I have felt more confident and comfortable spelling out what I think is maybe at least the best way of understanding that piece of the left that I just mentioned versus the right, because I think different, um, yeah, definitions are always hard, right? And I'm not trying to be squishy and evasive here. I just recognize the challenge, right? That for instance, as we know, when the language of left and right first start being used politically, I guess in 19th century France, the idea really is, the people who sit on the right in Parliament are basically the people who are the supporters of the monarchy and the status quo, and the people on the left are its critics, who might come from a variety of different places. And so there, the sense is when we talk about the left, we're talking about anti-establishment, and we talk about the right, we're talking about pro-establishment. Well, that's a really a general way of thinking that might have been what originally informed the language. On the other hand, maybe you want to, in some context, you might say, well, when we talk about the right, we're talking about, proponents of throne and altar, kind of traditional forms of social authority and so forth. But, often people might not use the terms that way. I'm, the Lewis brothers, historian and political scientist, just published a book, and I'd have to hunt for the title of the book, but talking about the ways in which, just in the context of American politics, much less the global political scene, the language of left and right has migrated and mutated over the past, say, 60 years, so that it's just very hard to clearly identify stable sets of positions that are clumped under those headings. I'm happy, as I say, to just spell out when I talk about the kind of thought on the left that I would find fruitful. I note the roots in the sorry, in the new left of the '60s. When I think about sorry about that, the positions on the right, we might be talking about the establishment. We might be talking about the use of, authoritarian means to prop up social hierarchies. We might be talking about throne and altar. I mean, there's such a broad range that I feel like I'm, you know, philosophers like to think that they can spell out essences for concepts and words. And I'm not in principle opposed to that, but I guess I think the sort of Wittgensteinian insight is very often, what we have are overlapping sets of ideas that ultimately get grouped under particular headings because of their connections with each other, but not because they all exemplify a single essence. So whether we're talking about that, establishment versus anti-establishment dynamic in 19th century France, whether we're talking about, defenders of throne and altar as over against proponents of freedom and social experimentation, whether we're talking about, just those who favor traditional social roles and values as opposed to the experimentation of the '60s. The the dichotomies, I think, to which the left right labels get applied seem to vary from period to period, and we'll probably gain the most by kind of drilling down and looking at particular examples more than by trying to spell out a single essence that will apply in all cases.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. No, I that makes a lot of sense to me. The the definitions do tend to vary a lot, and that this kind of touches on something else I've heard you talk about, which is um capitalism, the critique of capitalism,
Yeah.
or your
Yeah.
stance on anti-capitalism. And again, the term capitalism for me it's a bit of a problematic term because it just there's too many ways to interpret it. So could you give us your stance on that?
Yeah, so I agree 100% with what you just said. It's just a fundamentally problematic term, and it's one that I try to avoid these days using at all, because I think it just carries too many different meanings for too many different audiences. I mean, um, it seems problematic, first of all, because it's not obvious that um, we should have any particular interest in focusing specifically on capital as a feature of economic life. Obviously, capital is part of economic life. So in the traditional economic kind of trifecta, are land and labor. I think the way the term has come to be used, uh, it just ends up being a nonsense term. As my friend Roderick Long likes to emphasize, it's a term that ends up being used to mean something like, the market oriented economic system we have now, and therefore combines what are really incompatible elements. That is, it fails to take seriously the degree to which um, there's a tremendous amount of meddling and cronyism in the existing economic arrangements in anywhere we might want to look around the world, pretty much. And so somebody can either use the term and in so doing sort of undermine or underplay rather the extent to which there is this um, cronyism and meddling, or can use the term in a way that really is intended to damn market arrangements because of their association with cronyism and meddling. And I just feel like both of those are unhelpful. We want to tease apart what we might want to say about existing arrangements from what we might want to say about the merits of peaceful voluntary cooperation in the economic sphere. It seems to me the use of the term capitalism just takes us down roads we don't want to go. In an early essay about this topic, I teased out three different meanings of the term in Anarchy and Legal Order. Um, I distinguish, I think, five different meanings of the term. The fact that it's possible to do that, and given the tensions among those meanings, I think just highlights for me the importance of avoiding the term like the plague.
Yeah, okay. Okay. Um so it's interesting for me though because I think there is a kind of dictionary definition of the term that is fairly consistent across most dictionaries, which would be something like um a, an economic system based on the private ownership of capital. And I think, my thoughts on this, or what ends up happening, is people have their opinions on the effects of an economic system based on the private ownership of capital, and that kind of clouds the kind of base definition of this thing, right? Is that fair to say? I
Yeah,
don't
I
know.
think so. I think there certainly are debates about effects, and certainly also debates about the political backdrop to such a system, and so that I think there clearly are people at various points along the political spectrum, all the way from a certain kind of sort of nationalist, perhaps on the center right, to various kinds of statists somewhere along the center left. That's where many of these discussions are happening. Who just say, well, we need to take it for granted that there is this kind of interventionist political backdrop to any conceivable set of economic rates. It's not just a contingent historical fact that states are engaged in mischief on behalf of their cronies and favored groups and so forth. But for the folks I'm thinking about now, it should always just be taken for granted that there's no way to conceive of social arrangements without state action, which cannot, many of them, I think, would say, be neutral. And so ultimately, the state is preferring one group or another, and often I suppose they really just want to say, the important thing is that they prefer the group I favor. So I agree completely with you that we can offer that kind of very neutral definition. Um, but it does seem that when the term gets used in public debate, right, whether it's by, uh, again, the sort of, and again, I'm not thinking about people who are trying to be more philosophically precise, but just thinking about, whether it's a politician speaking in a legislature or a protester with a bullhorn. I think very often there are all these other kind of intellectual barnacles that are attached very quickly to that general definition. And so, again, we get this idea that it's a label not just for a market system, but again, the market system we have now, failing to recognize the tensions there. And it's because of that just kind of nonsensical concatenation of ideas, the failure to recognize the political mischief that does deform market relations and so forth. That I just think attempts to use the term to communicate clearly are likely to be beset with kind of insurmountable difficulty. So I just, really would urge folks not to employ it at the risk of being uh, completely misunderstood.
Yeah, yeah. Full disclosure, I am uh, one of the co-organizers for an event in the Calgary Capitalism and Morality event where we bring in a lot of libertarian and kind of
Yeah.
speakers to have these discussions. But I never, I and I know where the original organizers were coming from when they when they developed the name. So I don't take offense to it. But
Sure,
again,
sure.
in regular conversation, I do find it a problematic term for sure.
Yeah, if
Um,
you look, if you're in a setting like that where you can carefully spell out what you mean and why you find the term helpful, as opposed to some other alternative language you might use, I have no problem with that. That's certainly not a hill I want to die on. I just want to say, be really careful, you know.
yeah, yeah, for sure. Um, so from a philosophical perspective, I mean, you're an anarchist. I'm an anarchist.
Yeah, yeah,
Um, one thing I've been interested in is kind of the classical liberal lineage that kind of intertwines into the libertarian and anarchist
yeah,
stuff. But it also seems to me like some of the classical anarchists had appropriate criticisms and for rejecting what they called liberalism at the time, what we call classical liberalism. But like from a philosophical point, what do you see holes in, or what do you see as holes, or what's missing in some of the classical liberal philosophy?
yeah, yeah. Really, really important question, right? So, um, as enthusiastic a proponent of the strands of anarchism, I think a lot of people kind of in public conversations would immediately recognize. As enthusiastic proponent of those as Noam Chomsky is happy to say that anarchism as a broad political tradition is part of the liberal tradition, right? It's I've been struck by that. I can kind of find him saying that in more than one place. And I think you know so look, liberalism is a very complex set of social and political phenomena that it seems to me emerges from at least the following things, right? Um, so the wars of religion create the sense on the part of many people in Europe that we really need a way to constrain. Um, the scope of state power and the bases for political disagreement in ways that allow um, religious difference to flourish without turning into an occasion for violence. And so the wars of religion then provide one reason for an attempt to kind of constrain state power. The scientific revolution obviously provides people with a sense that there really can be rigorous, um, relatively speaking, at any rate, non-authority based approaches to at least answering an important subset of the questions that we pursue. And that, again, I think challenges certain kinds of authority structures. The discovery that markets can be as profoundly effective as they can, and more generally, that social arrangements can emerge from the bottom up rather than through top down imposition, clearly feeds into this. The growing skepticism about monarchical power and its justifications, the sense that appeals to divine right or to the perhaps later sort of Hobbesian story about the need for authoritarian power to restrain otherwise really destructive violence. The fact there might be alternatives to those sorts of justifications for authoritarian rule certainly matters. Certainly matter. Um, a sense that uh, that goes back to the late Middle Ages certainly, but that really starts to flower in later centuries of rights as kind of inhering in particular persons. And the kind of constraint that this imposes again on systemic power matters. I'm sure I'm forgetting some things, but liberalism, represents, I think, a confluence of um, these tendencies and trends, in say probably kind of starting in the 17th century in Europe and really kind of coming to full expression in the 18th century. And so, in that broad sense, right, where liberalism is understood as a tradition that seeks to limit power, that favors, bottom up social arrangements, and so forth, uh, it's pretty easy to see how classical liberalism, in the thought of people like Locke and Hume and Smith, and then later figures in the 19th century like on the one hand Cobden and Bright, on the other hand say Herbert Spencer, you come out of that tradition, and how at the same time those same impulses could clearly give rise to the more radical anarchist stance. And so it would hardly be surprising then that once those multiple reinforcing, mutually supportive influences get unleashed in social and political and intellectual and cultural life, on the one hand, we would see the more kind of moderate and meliorist developments that we might associate, especially say with the 18th century liberals, and why we might also see the same tendencies give rise to more radical positions as we find in 19th century anarchist and quasi-anarchist figures, and then similarly in the 20th century. It seems to me that um, an obvious sort of criticism that later radicals at various points along the political spectrum might, want to make, let's say of, probably the most, kind of brilliant of those early figures, David Hume, is that, Hume seems a little too willing to ratify and validate the Hanoverian status quo in England, um, and doesn't want to employ the resources of critical thought that he's developed to really ask probing foundational questions about the political order, about some of the social and economic arrangements that political order validates and upholds. Um, Hume is a kind of utilitarian before utilitarianism really was a thing, but I mean, his thought, kind of has that flavor. And in the nature of the case, it places a real premium on stability. And, there is, as is the case certainly with Hobbes, a great fear of what might happen. I think if violence gets unleashed and if too many aspects of the status quo are challenged all at once, I don't, and so, certainly somebody might wonder whether that was a flaw in the thought of the early liberals, and whether the more radical thinkers of the 19th century really were more true to the underlying insights of liberalism. And obviously, one can. I think be a radical critic of state power and of the uses of state power to prop up various institutions that shouldn't be propped up, while at the same time recognizing that there are also reasons to be worried about the kind of violence that people like Hobbes and Hume were troubled by. And I think those of us who have not lived through periods of civil war and so forth should probably not be too kind of knee jerk in our dismissal there. But I do think that's the kind of issue that later critics would certainly want to at least ask about. So when you talk about the both the connections between liberalism and anarchism, but also the potential flaws, it seems to me that's probably the place to start, at least in thinking about that.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and that's kind of, it's really interesting. That's something, there's kind of a story arc there where,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
liberalism planted the seeds for its own destruction in a sense, or something like that too, right? Which, or for at least for its own, like once it became the dominating um, political infrastructure, then it also spawned the more radical, its foundational stuff spawned the more radical criticisms of itself, right? So
Yes, and also ironically, I hadn't thought about it in just these terms until you framed things the way you did here. But when so the underlying ideas clearly can be pushed in the more radical direction of later kind of again anarchist and quasi-anarchist thinkers. At the same time, it also perhaps undermines itself. Liberalism undermines itself in a different way, insofar as it provides the vocabulary at a superficial level um, for what really are, I think, fundamentally anti-liberal movements. So when, you have people like, like Hobhouse and T.H. Green and so forth in England, or the equivalent folks in North America, Herbert Crowley and so forth. Um, they often want to talk as if they are heirs of the liberal tradition and they're just applying liberal ideas and principles in a new way, when in fact, it seems to me what they're doing, perhaps even more than they themselves quite realize, is providing a sort of rationalization for the power of the new managerial class, which is not particularly hospitable in many ways to some traditional liberal insights. And so whether you're thinking about um, the so-called new liberals in North America or kind of social democrats and Fabians in Britain, it feels like they want to use liberal language, but really kind of push in an illiberal direction. So it's another way in which I guess I'm just thinking about this about the irony here. On the one hand, the anarchists and quasi-anarchists are drawing on liberal ideas and radicalizing them at the same time as the quote new liberals are taking liberal language and using it to sort of rationalize sort of the growth of both corporate and state managerial bureaucracies and so forth. It's just kind of interesting how in both of those ways liberalism ironically creates challenges for itself.
Yeah, for sure. It's the like a narrative of the competing suns or something like
Yeah,
that,
yeah, yeah,
right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah,
Nice.
yeah.
Um,
No, that's really cool. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess that's kind of been in the back of my mind, for a while. Um, um, so obviously, I mean, you touched on some criticisms of like modern liberals.
mhm.
Now, but I'm kind of interested too in your criticisms of what would be considered kind of the modern libertarian movement, and but even from a philosophical framework, or if you have any. I was under the impression you did, and I'm not equating this to the like libertarian political parties, but from a philosophical standpoint.
Yeah, I mean, so I have a fairly idiosyncratic approach to a number of things, and let me just try to talk about that first, maybe as background to thinking about an answer to your question. Um, when I first started to read um, libertarian political thought as a high school and college student, I was exposed a little more clearly. I'm sure I had run across the idea before, but certainly exposed with greater kind of focus and intensity to the idea of natural law. And the idea of natural law is a very long-standing one, right? In sort of Western European political philosophy, it probably and moral philosophy, it probably goes back, at least as far as the Stoics, um, and as is predictable for any sort of idea or cluster of ideas with that lengthy a pedigree, it gets used in a lot of different ways. And I I remember being really excited when I started to read and take seriously at the end of college, right after the end of college, I guess. Um, a particular strand of, I think, quite philosophically sophisticated natural law thinking um, that's become prominent in the post World War II era, that we might associate with, um, interestingly, because of differences that I'd have with them on other fronts. some I think very fine, quite conservative Catholic thinkers, notably Germain Grisey and John Finnis. And I noticed that while libertarians and anarchists of various sorts um, liked the language of natural law, their approach probably was more informed by some other people, certainly by Locke's natural rights thinking, which some people try to make natural rights and natural law, um, alternative or competitive views. I don't think that's right. I think they're best understood in tandem with each other. But anyway, Locke was an important figure there. The American philosopher John Wilde, I know, was quite influential on the libertarian political theorist Murray Rothbard. Um, Nobody was kind of paying attention to this group of thinkers whose work I found really fruitful. It was an attempt to kind of take the Aristotelian and Thomist ideas of earlier generations and show what they might look like in the terms of sort of contemporary analytic moral philosophy. And um, I didn't try to, immediately turn those into the bases for anything like a libertarian or anarchist political theory, not least because I was sadly in that period of my life, dwelling in a sort of boringly, non-libertarian place. As I've often said, George W. Bush and Barack Obama turned me back into an anarchist. Um, but but I kind of just let these ideas marinate. I thought about them, worked on them, turned them over in my mind, and increasingly came to understand them and embrace them. Um, what this is not, I suppose, a kind of ground level critique of anybody else's libertarian or anarchist ideas. I just don't know of anybody else who's tried to articulate those ideas using this particular theoretical frame. That um, it's been a way of trying to understand um, uh, property and uh, the justice system and state authority and so forth, using a particular set of resources that have not really been drawn on by some other people, and also using those resources in a way that, to be fair, is not at all the way in which those who have most commonly deployed them have understood them. Right. So if you think about, I mean, we don't need to wander down this rabbit hole particularly, but Finnis and Grisey and Finnis's student, the political theorist at Princeton, Robbie George, are all, I think, um, in some broad sense, um, you know, I mean, again, they're conservative Catholics. They favor state authority. Um, they're uh, you know, Finnis has said at various points that he kind of sees Thomas Aquinas and John Stuart Mill as not really differing fundamentally as regards, sort of the harm principle and the use of state authority to mandate morality. But um, the devil's in the details, and I think um, these folks in general have been more hospitable to the use of state power vis-a-vis both social life and economic life to achieve what they take to be good ends. And so I've had this sort of interesting experience of trying to see how a theoretical position that seemed intuitively really attractive to me could be developed in a way that was compatible with other instincts and impulses and intuitions that I had that were not at all shared by the people who initially embraced it. So, on the one hand, that means I've tried to work it out in a way that's very different from the kind of broadly communitarian views despite their differences in other matters, of Finnis and Grisey and George and Joe Boyle, and on the other hand, to use the approach to defend anarchism and kind of broadly libertarian ideas in a way that is different from the kind of defense that we'd find advanced by other proponents of anarchist and libertarian ideas. And so that's not to claim any profound insight on my part. It's really just probably that I found a particular approach to uh, moral and legal and political theory appealing, and on the other hand, also found the libertarian and anarchist critiques of state power important, and over time, just kind of allowed those ideas to evolve and come together in various ways. So that's the first thing I'd say. It's a long, maybe a bit of a detour, but there's a kind of deep theoretical idiosyncrasy, maybe on my part, that distinguishes me from some other people there. Um, I don't think, as a general matter, I'm terribly interested in on substantive matters, on kind of wrapping other people on the knuckles. That's not where I derive most of my intellectual and kind of existential satisfaction. But probably where I do find myself willing to raise critical questions about the kind of self-described, libertarian movements, especially in North America, because as we know, the term libertarian gets used in a whole range of ways, and certainly differently in Europe, where often the focus is, just more broadly on anti-authoritarianism and perhaps often on anti-authoritarian varieties of, say, socialist or communist anarchism. Um, but if we're talking about what's going on in the more in the North American context, I think where two kinds of criticisms I do want to make, which are not across the board and which would be absolutely echoed, I think, by people, within, other strands or tendencies of libertarian and anarchist movements. So I'm not claiming this is at all unique to me. Um, but, I think one of the key things that, uh, left libertarians of the sort I have, tried to, to whose ideas and development I've tried to contribute, there certainly has been an awareness that criticisms of some criticisms of state power and state overreach can take the form of celebrating existing social and economic arrangements without taking seriously the degree to which they might be in one way or another distorted by uh, the intervention of the state. So I think that matters. Another thing that I've wanted to highlight, and again, lots of folks would agree here from different places along the ideological spectrum, but you asked about criticism, so it's a criticism, at least of some subset of folks who might think of themselves as libertarian or classical liberal. Um, I think there can be a really profound impulse, and it's one that I've experienced and I recognize, and I don't want to be, kind of contemptuous of it all, but it's an impulse that says if we recognize the value of freedom and social experimentation and rights and all the various things that might be seen as valuable parts of the liberal tradition, then we ought to be willing to use state power to oppose those around the world who infringe on these values. And some people, I think, whom I certainly take seriously, want to um, offer kind of broadly libertarian rationales for the global use of military power. I am not a pacifist, but I am a pretty vigorous opponent, or proponent rather, of placing as many constraints on the way in which the systemic state force of war is carried on. I think I'm a big supporter of the folks at antiwar.com. I firmly believe that war is, you know, the health of the state, as Randolph Bourne famously said. I think that war is, um, for multiple reasons, to be resisted wherever possible. And so I don't for an instant think that any and all classical liberals and libertarians do embrace this idea that we ought to use state military force to promote liberty around the world. But I do think there are some folks who do think that, and I think for reasons we can talk more about, but I just think that's a counterproductive and deeply problematic idea. So criticisms, different theoretical frame than a lot of my compatriots. Um, a concern to make sure we don't underplay the importance of intervention in shaping existing arrangements, and a deep concern about even very well-intentioned efforts and defenses of war and militarism.
Yeah. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it did. It kind of takes us full circle to, these some of these words become
Yeah.
problematic, and libertarian is another one of them. I find these days that the term has become so broad that I have a hard time. I use it selectively, depending on the company I'm in, right?
Yeah. Sure.
Yeah, yeah. Um, and so there's a few things you touched on as far as coming from adding to the kind of canon on natural law and whatnot, and your contributions coming at it from a different angle. That I think that's a good segue into your book, Anarchy and Legal Order, which was a book I really enjoyed. Started flipping through it again before I had you on the show here. Um, so tell me a bit about that. Like I think it seemed to me at the time you did approach some of those subjects from a position that wasn't like the subjects like a stateless society and non-aggression and property rights, or what you referred to as I forget, possessory.
In that book, I use the language just possessory claims.
Yes, yeah, yeah, exactly. Um, and it seemed to me like you did come from kind of a different position than other people have come from on that. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much for calling attention to Anarchy and Legal Order. It's a book in which I tried to sort of bring a set of resources in legal and political theory to bear on the defense of, kind of broadly left market anarchism. And I wrote that book. I note for the benefit of anyone who picks it up. I wrote that book at a time at which I was really enamored of, let's say, radical transparency in writing scholarly work, and that meant that every section and subsection had to begin by telling the reader once again what I was going to do and how I was going to do it. And I fear that the book ends up being, 20 or 30% longer because of my repetitive desire to spell everything out in that way. And probably I would do some trimming there if I wrote the book again. So the book is long, and if you pick it up, listener, viewer, I hope you do. I hope you read it. I hope you find it interesting. There may be some tough slogging at some points just because of the way in which I chose to structure it. In any case, what I try to do in that book is to first of all explain this approach to natural law thinking. I'm not trying to offer my own independent defense of that approach. It's just that if you talk about um, Kantian ethics or utilitarian ethics at the beginning of a book that has some kind of root in ethics, people will generally know what you're talking about, but they probably won't know what you're talking about here. So I needed to spell out the basic logic of this approach. And it's an approach that emphasizes the diverse ways in which creatures like us flourish, are fulfilled, uh, you know, in which their lives go well, right? Different synonyms that all basically mean the same thing. And so I start out trying to think about, highlight these different dimensions or aspects of well being, and note that one of those, only one of them, is reasoning well about living well, and that can be worked out in terms of, as I suggest, several principles. The most important for present purposes being ones I call fairness and respect. Um, so fairness, not making arbitrary distinctions among the people who were affected by our actions, and respect, essentially not purposefully attacking, anyone's well-being. And there are some other things that for instance, the idea of making commitments to sort of diving deep and pursuing particular aspects of well-being in a less than superficial way. I wrote a whole book about that later because I think it's such an interesting and important topic. But anyway, so I lay out, I think, five key principles and link them with this sense of multidimensional human flourishing. Using that as the backdrop then for an approach to um, rights in bodies and with regard to property, as I said, kind of just possessory claims, as we talked about a moment ago. Um, and the idea, I think, is that I want to take a basic ethical view or moral view. Probably moral is probably the better word. Ethical, I prefer to reserve for theories of morality. And show how this account, that's basically an account of how we treat ourselves and other particular persons, can be used to kind of build up to an account of legal institutions for a stateless society. So, where, for instance, a kind of Lockean view of the kind that I think many libertarians might be familiar with seeks to build an account of property rights by seeing those rights as extensions directly of our rights in our own bodies. Um, what I try to do is begin with the assumption that the new natural law thinkers begin with, that there really is an important distinction between our bodies and things external to them, but that um, a kind of reasonable picture of social life makes good sense of a set of robust property rights. And here I draw on the new natural law thinkers' own views. The new natural law thinkers here meaning people like Grisey and Finnis. They draw on their own views, but their own views, while they certainly allow for property rights, kind of offer an account of those rights that would permit a fair amount of um, interference with them by the state, and they kind of, I think, see a few very kind of general constraints as affecting the sort of property rights scheme that might obtain. I spent a lot of time in the second chapter, third chapter, anyway, of the book, second chapter, I guess, trying to show why there might be a number of other constraints of a piece with the ones they acknowledge that more tightly limit the sorts of rules that we might all have good reason to agree on with respect to a scheme of possessory claims in a society we want to live in. So that takes up a lot of space in that chapter, and that then allows me to both that and what I say about our bodies and so forth in light of the natural law moral position I've defended in the first chapter. That allows me to go on from there to talk about things like slavery, to explain what a sort of complex case against the permissibility of slavery might look like, and also to say something about some other things about um, at least some important subclass of non-human animals as morally considerable. The account of property that I offer um, is paired with a discussion of intellectual property, and try to explain why I think we might want to be skeptical about that. And so then I go on from there in the book to think about the status of law. I go on from there to explain why I think state authority is problematic, and in light of the basic picture of rights that I've developed, then to talk about law in a stateless society, kind of the status of law in such a society, and then to look at a variety of sort of specific kinds of issues, and to show why it might make sense to link the project that I've developed in the book with projects that might self-identify as leftist, perhaps particularly ones that do have ties, as I've said, with the new left of the '60s. So, I try not just to affirm that this is a leftist project, but I also try in the same chapter of the book to reclaim the word socialist. I'm not convinced that that was a viable activity. I think my friends from Eastern Europe who were kind of brought up dealing with institutions that were labeled socialist have found the word so poisoned that it's very hard for them to take it seriously when I use it there. So I've been more hesitant since then, but I used it that way there because people like, say, the great 19th and early 20th century American anarchist Benjamin Tucker was okay with using the word, and I am very appreciative of Tucker's work, and probably was trying to offer an homage to him by taking that position. I didn't ultimately hang on to that, but anyway, that's the kind of thing I do in the book.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Gary, this has been fantastic. I got to have you back. I got a lot more
Love it.
questions,
Happy.
and yeah, this has been really good. I really appreciate taking the time. Thanks a lot for coming on.
Pleasure.
Thanks to Gary Chartier. You can check him out at garychartier.net. I recommend his book, Anarchy and Legal Order. Thanks for listening. See you later.